Hello to you all that's in the room and happy Black History Month. I am Anthony Pegues, Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Justice here at Defenders of Wildlife. And thanks for joining us to celebrate and acknowledge this special time of year where we illuminate the efforts and the achievements and the challenges of African Americans in conservation. I first want to extend a warm welcome to all our guests that have joined us today and say hello again to my fellow staff members that are here as well. DEIJ is important to the mission of Defenders as we continue to amplify the voices of and increase representation of marginalized communities in conservation. Defenders is ensuring that DEIJ is at the core of all of what we do. And this webinar that was spearheaded by members of our Texas office, Azalea and Sherry, and supported by their fellow Observant State Committee members and members of various departments across Defenders is just one of the ways we are making sure that we move the DEIJ needle a little bit forward. Since our Texas office opened in 2018, they have hit the ground running and its team members have worked diligently to bring diverse voices of Texas to us in a three-part webinar. These webinars will feature dynamic speakers that will show how diversity is being implemented in conservation efforts in Texas and how these efforts can be used across the country. Moderating these events is David Smallwood. Our moderator's work at the Dallas Zoo as a conservation interpreter gives him the opportunity to do two things that he loves most. That is talking and engaging people on meaningful topics. He often says that he will talk about conservation at the drop of a hat and is usually the one to drop that hat. So being one of the faces of education and community impact at the zoo is one of his greatest joys. So I hope that you are ready to be enlightened by today's presentation and make sure that you jot down your questions for the Q&A. Again, on behalf of Defenders of Wildlife, again, thank you and welcome and thank you for joining us today. Also, to see what else Defenders is doing, make sure you check us out at defenders.org. That's DEFENDERS.org. So without further ado, never the one to pass up the opportunity to represent. Please welcome Mr. David Smallwood. Mr. Smallwood, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Anthony. Thank you so much. All right, happy Black History Month, everybody. My name is David Smallwood, and I'd like to thank the Defenders of Wildlife for letting me be the moderator today and for the rest of the series. So a little bit about myself. I do work at the Dallas Zoo. I work in the areas of education and conservation. This gives me the opportunity to basically be one of the faces of the zoo. If it's going out doing conservation efforts, I'm there. If it's talking to kids or teaching members and zoo visitors throughout the zoo about our conservation efforts and the things that we have going on all throughout the world, I'm one of those faces that they see. And I take great pride in that because when kids come and they see my beautiful chocolatey face, they see that they can do it too. I've had kids come and they ask, hey, you work here, you do this and you do that? And I was like, yeah, and so can you. Dallas Zoo has been very good to me and very big on representation and diversity. So I can ramble on about myself, but we're not here for just me today. The guy who I will be presenting, who I have the pleasure of presenting, I don't get impressed by too many people, but I'm impressed by this individual right here. Let me start it off right now. All right, so he is the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer for Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, also known as TPWD, an agency of the state of Texas. His role is developing and managing the execution of TPWD's diversity and inclusion strategy. He is also the former Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer for FedEx Office, Inc. He is an accomplished cultural compliance and management professional with years of experience in the areas of relationship building, leadership developing, mentorship, training, and executive coaching. David also provides insight on behavioral management, cultural understanding, multi-generational management, and ethical and government compliance. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Mr. David Buggs.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I hope everybody is staying warm. It is a different time of year. I know it's supposed to be cold during the wintertime, but sometimes I think it goes a little too far, but you know, who am I to complain? I'm glad I'm here. So I'm very thankful that I was invited to come and speak with this outstanding group I'm really appreciative of Azalea and Anthony and Sharon and David reaching out and saying, hey, we'd love for you to come and speak. Now, I don't know why they asked me. Maybe after we finish, they'll never ask me to come and speak again. But I want to just come and share the little bit of knowledge that I have about what we focus on when we start thinking about engaging people of color in conservation. In particular, because it's Black History Month, I wanted to share a little more information with you. Some you may know, you may be familiar with, and some you may say, well, boy, that's different. That's new for me. So I'm going to do this in kind of a two-part thing. Because, again, this is Black History Month, and don't get me started on Black History Month, because Black history is year-round, but we'll talk about that later at a different time. I want to share a little presentation with you. But at the end of that, I want to talk a little bit about the meat of how we start making some moves to make some changes. I'll tell you a little bit about what we're doing at Texas Parks and Wildlife. And then I want to hear from you. I want to hear about some of the things that you all are doing. I want to hear about some of the things that you're thinking, or ask me some questions about some of the things that we're doing that maybe be able to help you move the needle within your organization, within your particular group. So without further ado, if I don't mess this up, I'm going to start this presentation. So hopefully everybody can see the presentation, and I'm very excited to kind of share this. This is not my first time sharing some of this information, and I always find it fascinating to hear some of the feedback from folks after they go through it. So one of the things that we want to share with you all is the understanding that, there is different aspects when it comes to conservation and what we call conservation. One of the things that we know is it's a scientific fact that when we start talking about diversity and biodiversity, nobody struggles with that, because we also understand that when you have diversity in your environment, within your habitat, it makes for a sturdy environment, a strong ecosystem. And we want also to make sure folks understand that's the same thing when you have people diversity. It makes for a sturdier environment, more innovation, more productivity, more understanding of the folks that you're going to serve. And we've got to make sure that we're engaging rural and conservation places, rural and conservation locations in this focus around conservation, around inclusion, around making sure that the things that we're doing are sustainable, not just for us, but for generations to come. Right now, we know who those current voices are across the landscape of conservation. And most of them don't necessarily look like me. And I bring that up quite often when I go to different places and talk with different folks. But how do we go about changing that? Because if we don't change that, the sustainability of the resources that we share, this environment, these flora and fauna that we all love, is going to be in jeopardy. And actually, it already is. But how do we go about changing that? Well, I believe making sure that everybody feels included in that is the major way to make all these things that we love, that we support, sustainable. So one of the things, again, getting into this thing of history, and one of the things that I share with folks all the time is history is just that. It's his story. It may not be your story, but whoever's in charge at the time gets to tell the story. But what I want to emphasize is that outdoors, the environment, conservation, and engagement in conservation is everybody's story. So we're going to talk about the story, not just his story. So first of all, we all came from an agrarian background. I mean, when you look back, all of us can trace our lineage to somebody that was working in outdoors, somebody that was tilling the land, not just for survival, but also for sustainability. We all had great-grandpas or great-grandmas and so on and so forth, regardless of race or creed, that were engaged in the outdoors. When you just look at the state of Texas, and I did some research on this because I'm looking at our population now. In 1918, only 15% of the folks in the state of Texas lived in an urban area, 15%. In 2018, only 15% of residents lived in a rural area. 85% of the folks in the state of Texas live in urban areas. So we all had some lineage, some link to the outdoors because we had to, because the preponderance of us didn't live in any urban areas. But I will take it back even further than that, because we all have that intrinsic appreciation for the outdoors in us. But it started way back in the past, even before we came to these states. Now, if you're looking at the screen right now, I put something up there. It's a rough rendering of a rearview mirror, but you can see what you see in that rearview mirror. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our past. And since this is Black History Month, and I have information on Hispanic history, Asian history, and all that, but since this is Black History Month, we're going to talk about the history of Black folks in the outdoors. And it started way before colonialism. Actually, when you start looking at the data and doing some research, and there's all kind of data out there, getting engaged in the outdoors and agri-life started in sub-Saharan Africa in 1800 BC. 1800 BC. Now, what you're looking at now is a snapshot of things that were happening in sub-Saharan Africa in around 1500 BC, before colonialism. But agriculture, engaging with outdoors, engaging with wildlife, farming, and so on and so forth, was happening thousands of years before the time that other folks came to Africa. This is just a rendering that somebody came up with of what a particular farm might look like in sub-Saharan Africa. And here are a few of the crops that were grown in sub-Saharan Africa. There was rice, okra, black-eyed peas, yams, kidney beans, lima beans, peanuts, millet, apples, different types of apples, sorghum, watermelon, cotton. Pause right there. There was also animal husbandry, where folks were herding cattle, where they were taming different animals. They were out in the wild. There was fishing, there was hunting. All these things were happening. So here's the thing that I look at when I saw that, and these were things that were happening before folks were captured and brought here through the Middle Passage. When folks were brought to the US, they weren't brought here just for labor. They were brought here because they had a skill, because they already had the technology to grow different types of crops. So that made me think, our ancestors were engaged in the outdoors, not just from a survival level, but from a technical, agricultural level, way before this land, this US that we call America right now, was even discovered, before it was even hatched. We were engaged in the technical side of conservation. Now, this is something, because of the agency I work with, we do a lot of supporting of hunting in the outdoors, you know, and I know your organization doesn't necessarily do that, but we support that. But when we support it, and there's a lot of rules around it, but we support it within the rules, because in a lot of places, a lot of the apex animals are taken away. So hunting is prevalent, but hunting is also somewhat necessary to create a balance in the particular ecosystem. But one of the things I get is, well, you know, but Black people don't hunt. Well, I beg to differ, because again, I showed you the data that came out of sub-Saharan Africa in the 1500s, but also in the US. When they started shutting down plantations after emancipation, one of the things that remained was hunting. And a lot of the plantations were turned into hunting plantations. And guess who the hunting guides were? Guess who the folks were that went out and understood the wild, understood the flora, understood the fauna, understood the animal life and how different animals react to different things and different stimuli, and how to capture, where to look. It was people that look like you and me. Well, people that look like me. I don't know what everybody else looks like, but people that look like me. They were those skilled hunting guys. And a lot of that continued even up into the 1920s, where on a lot of these plantations, they were skilled hunting guys. They were African-American. Even today, In South Carolina and parts of Georgia, the practice of training hunting dogs is still done predominantly by African Americans. There are different groups that still do that. Now, this is somebody that some of you all may have heard about when you're in elementary school, James P. Beckworth. He was one of the most renowned fur trappers, hunters, explorers in the entire US. Now, a lot of times folks won't talk about him, but his lore is out there. I encourage you to go out there and look him up. Another person is a gentleman by the name of Hart Collier. Hart Collier was a big game hunter. He was renowned for hunting bear, so much so that Teddy Roosevelt, who was the president in the early 19th century, early in the, when Teddy Roosevelt was president, actually requested Hart Collier to lead him on a hunt, to be his hunting guide on a bear hunt. And this is the place where, and there's a whole lot of stories behind that, but Teddy Roosevelt got the name Teddy Bear because Hart Collier actually caught a bear for Roosevelt to come and to harvest. And when Roosevelt got there, he refused to harvest the bear. So his men started teasing him and calling him Teddy Bear. But that was orchestrated by a renowned African-American Black hunter by the name of Hart Collier. There's also another gentleman by the name of George Schubert, who was also a skilled hunter. He was also a trainer of hunting dogs. He knew, understood the weather. He understood the stream, the flora and the fauna. And everyone requested that he take them out on bird hunts or fox hunts and all that kind of stuff, just because of his skill level. Another person that some of you all have heard of, but you didn't know all of his background, is a gentleman by the name of York. York was the body man for Lewis and Clark when they went on the Lewis and Clark expedition across the West, looking for a waterway to the Pacific. But York was instrumental in not only his hunting skills, but his understanding of flora, of fauna, his understanding of rivers and streams, his understanding of reading the stars and being able to navigate across those landscapes. Very instrumental. Now, when we start talking about Black conservationists, we think about a few folks that we may have heard of recently, and we may get into a few of them as well. But I want to share a few other folks with you. One is very important that you all know is Harriet Tubman. Now, when you hear the word Harriet Tubman, you think, well, no, Underground Railroad. She didn't have, yes, she did. She had some great outdoor skills. She understood which plants were used for medicine, which plants were used for food, how to call different animals. She mastered different types of bird calls because she used those bird calls in order to send signals to those folks that she was trying to help get through the Underground Railroad. There were stories about her actually going to bear dens during hibernation season and hiding out in the bear dens because the folks that were tracking her would never think that she would understand how to go in there and come out alive. She was a great conservationist, understood everything about the outdoors. And we all know the stories about her being able to read the stars. Another group is Buffalo Soldiers, which most of you have heard of, who were our first national park rangers. And they played an instrumental role in taming a lot of the West. You know, when you hear about folks talking about taming the West, they usually don't show pictures that look like us. But these folks were instrumental in taming the West. They went before those other folks that came along and said they tamed the West. The first national park superintendent was Captain Charles Young. He was the superintendent of, I think it was, not Yosemite. I'll get back to you on one of the national parks, but he was the first national park superintendent. Outstanding career in the outdoors, engaging his troops in the outdoors, not only fighting off rebels and so on and so forth, but also maintaining and managing park trails and so on and so forth. Great history. I encourage you to go out and look it up. Also, if you look just in the state of Texas, you start thinking about these state parks, and hopefully everybody's had an opportunity to visit the state parks. But did you know a number of our state parks were actually built by African-American units? They used to call them colored units, or they used to call them the CCC small c. I encourage you to go out and do some research on that. But a lot of the state parks were built by these units, not only African-American units, but also Hispanic units. So there's rich history of us being engaged in the outdoors. Now, when you start talking about scientists, and I'm going to go through these a little quicker, Dr. Charles Henry Turner graduated from University of Cincinnati in 1907. He was a renowned zoologist. He studied the behaviors of insects and bees and ants and different critters that help manage the ecosystems. Everybody knows about George Washington Carver, but they don't know about some of his research on plant rotations, crop rotations, managing ecosystems, different crops that you can plant in different areas. A lot of history there. He was also a really good businessman, made a lot of money off of some of the products that he developed through some of his plant research in chemistry that he did with plants. Another is Dr. Ernest Just, marine biologist, famed scientist, graduated from Dartmouth back in 1907. He focused on the role of cell surface development in organisms. Also, here's another gentleman that I just found out about, Dr. Theodore Spigman. He was the first African-American to get a PhD in conservation, and he encouraged different universities, especially some of the minority-serving universities, to start developing careers and curriculum around conservation. There's also Dr. Roger Young. She was also a student of Dr. Just. Dr. Young was the first African-American female to publish in the Journal of Science. Now, initially when she did it, she had to publish under a surname so nobody would find out who she was, because she figured if they found out it was an African-American and female, they'd never publish her articles. But she was able to get that done, became an outstanding researcher and a professor. There's also Dr. Jessie Isabel Price, who was a microbiologist, had a huge focus on the organisms that were affecting plant life and animal life. And she was the first person to develop vaccines for bird diseases. There's Dr. Marie Taylor, who was also a botanist, and she did research on plant photomorphogenesis. Say that 3 times real fast. There's Dr. Betty Lane Collette. She was a bacteriologist, and she's also focused on veterinary science, and she studied hypertension in all types of animals. There's Dr. Joan Owens, who was a marine biologist, and she actually named and discovered different types of coral. There's Dr. June Bacon Bursey, who was the first African-American woman to gain a degree in atmospheric science. She worked for NASA, for NOAA, and she also did a stint with the American Meteorology Society. She was one of those other hidden figures that we were just finding out about. There's Hattie Cawthorn, who was a community activist. One of the things that Ms. Cawthorn is famed for is when there was this huge migration of people of color from the South to the North, they found out when they got to these different places, to the Chicagos and to the New York, that they didn't have that greenery. They didn't have that outdoor engagement like they did when they were in the South. And it's innate in all of us. We talked about it earlier. So what Ms. Cawthorn started doing was petitioning the city. So when there were vacant lots there, she would actually get the community to convert the vacant lot into a green space. So there were green spaces in these different neighborhoods. There were places for kids to play. There were places for folks to grow vegetable gardens. There were places where folks could just relax and be a part of nature within these different cityscapes. If you go out and do some research on her, there's a lot of information about things that are still happening in the New York area because of the work that she started. Now, when we start talking about modern day Black scientists, there's Jasper Harris, who worked for the National Science Foundation. He was a meteorologist as well. Did a lot of studies around water preservation in the US. There's Dr. Robert Trent, who was a leading expert on coral. He's another microbiologist, studied algae and the effect that algae had on the environment. There's Dr. Harris Williams, who was big in a lot of the research that folks are now starting to catch on around climate change. He started studying climate change. Now it says he had a 40-year career, but he's been out of academia for a while. But he started studying this back in the 60s, climate change, mind-boggling. There's also Dr. Mamie Parker, who she and I have actually developed a good friendship. She is a fisheries scientist, and she was the first African-American and female to be appointed over a region for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Same thing for Dr. Benjamin Tuggle, who was a wildlife biologist that was appointed Assistant Director of Science Applications. Another guy who I've gotten to know, and he's actually since retired, is Hannibal Bolton. He was a fisheries biologist also, but he was over the department that did restoration programs for fish and wildlife. And there's a gentleman by the name of Jerome Ford, who is actually graduated from the same undergrad school I did in Louisiana from Southern University, who is over the migratory bird program for U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And these are folks that have done and are doing great things. And a lot of folks don't know who they are. So I want to introduce these folks to you. So when we start talking about Blacks in conservation, I want you to know you can be proud of some of the things that we've already done and are continuing to do. There's Mavene Betchy, whose father was Lincoln Lewis, Abraham Lincoln Lewis, who bought American Beach. He was one of the first Black millionaires in the state of Florida. He bought a beach property to conserve it, also to create a place where African Americans could go and relax and play on the ocean. And she continued to preserve that property even after her grandfather passed away. There's John Francis. Some of you all may have heard John Francis. He was called a planet walker, who in protest of petroleum drilling and the degradation of different natural escapes, decided that he wasn't going to speak for 17 years. And he just walked all over North and South America, just protesting silently some of the things that we were doing to our environment. There's Frank and Audrey Peterman, who are public land experts. They both worked in private industry. And when they got ready to retire, they started traveling different places. And they noticed there was nobody in those different landscapes that looked like them. So they decided to take it upon themselves to know as much about public land across the U.S. as anybody. And now they're leading experts on public lands across America. And they're always going around sharing ideas and how we can engage people from different backgrounds in public lands. Now, there's a next group of folks, and I'm going to go through these real quickly, that are doing some outstanding things. And these are folks that we need to look out for in the future. First of all, there's Dr. Drew Langham. And Drew and I have become good friends. Drew is a wildlife biologist. He's also a professor at Clemson, and he does a lot of bird studies, and he leads a lot of bird viewing tours across the U.S. There's Nikki Knowles, who is another PhD in micro and cellular biology. She does a lot of things around coral research and invertebrate research and sharks and alligators and so on and so forth. She is a bad sister. Another one is Karina Newsom, who I've gotten to develop a pretty decent relationship with. Karina is an ornithologist, and Karina is actually the person, some of you all may have heard of Black Birders Week. Karina was one of the co-founders of Black Birders Week. Then there's April Cruston. She and I are on a committee based out of DC together that we need to make sure Defenders is a part of, called a diversity joint venture. But April is a policy and planning and evaluation administrator for NOAA. And she is another outstanding, smart, really smart sister. Then there's Dr. Powell Johnson. She is a geochemist and chemical oceanographer. She was the first African-American female to get a degree in chemical oceanography. And she was the first African-American to get a doctoral degree in oceanography from Texas A&M. Now, this is one, and I put way too much information on it because she's a good friend of mine, is Dr. Ray Wynn Grant. Ray Wynn is the bomb. Ray Wynn is not only a fellow for National Geographic, but she studies large carnivores. That is her thing. She loves big animals with big teeth, which I don't understand, but that's her thing. But she does an outstanding job. Another one is Dr. Ayanna Johnson. She's a marine biologist. She does a lot of things around policy and conservation strategy. There's Danielle Washington. For some of you folks that have some background in Florida, Danielle actually is a marine biologist. She started an organization called Big Blue and You Foundation that actually goes out and teaches kids about marine biology, about the ocean, about the atmosphere, and young folks doing their thing. I love it. Then there's Dudley Edmondson. He is a wildlife photographer and author. When I shared his background with some of the folks in my organization, they couldn't believe it because they couldn't believe that a person of color would be doing this kind of work. But I encourage you to go out, write down Dudley Edmondson, go out to his website and look at some of his work. It's outstanding. Then there's James Edward Mills, who is a journalist, and he writes stories about the outdoors and outdoor recreation. He's also a mountain climber. Think about that, a mountain climber. Then there's Eric Morris, who started an organization, started in Texas called Black Wolf Hunt Club. And now he's gone on and he has a TV show called Non-Traditional Outdoorsman. Also another couple who are good friends of mine, Wayne Hubbard and Candace Price. They host the show, and they actually started the show back in 2003. It's called Urban American Outdoors, where they talk about the multicultural engagement of people of color from urban areas in the outdoors. Great show. And these are the folks that I encourage you to go out, research, find out what they're doing, connect with them. And here's the thing that's great about all of them. They're willing to come and talk to your groups about what they're doing and how what they're doing is starting to make a difference in engaging in the outdoors and understanding conservation, understanding the environment and how we are to manage and sustain the environment. So why is diversity inclusion, and I'm shifting now, why is diversity inclusion important to conservation? Well, we all know that diversity inclusion strengthens your environment. It strengthens the conservation movement because you got folks with different voices, different viewpoints, and different backgrounds that are participating. It also makes it relevant to this wider band of people. When you start looking at the state of Texas right now, just in the state of Texas, it's 61% people of color. It's also 52% female. And the fastest growing age demographic is between 25 and 30. How do we engage that group? You got to have folks that can understand and relate to that group and make what we do relevant to that group in order for those things that we know are important to everybody to continue to be sustained and continue to be supported. Something else we've got to understand is when you have inclusion in conservation, it also creates political support. You've got folks that are coming on board that are being put into public office that now get, hey, look, this is important to my constituents, so it's got to also be important to me. It also brings about financial support because there's a lot of folks on both sides of the aisle that recognize we've got to put our money behind our mouths when it comes to conservation. And we just face an environmental challenge nowadays like never before. And we don't have everybody supporting it, everybody on board. We all lose. So some suggestions that we can get into, and I know my time is short. We've got to start looking at our diversity policy within our organization. We've got to start looking at setting hiring goals. One of the things that we have a group that does is focus on recruiting from historically Black colleges and universities or Hispanic serving institutes or different types of MSIs. We actually have some MOUs with different groups where we do internships specifically with those groups. Some of you all may be familiar with Houston-Tillerson University. It's a HBCU in Austin. We have an agreement with Houston-Tillerson University where we get at least 6 folks to come and do internships for us every year. And we're looking at how we can start hiring some of those folks. We're developing the same thing with Sol Ross University, which is a Hispanic Serving Institute. We're working on a relationship with Prairie View A&M University. We're also looking at developing the same type of relationship with the UTSA, which is a Hispanic Serving Institute. So you got to have a pipeline. Otherwise, what you're doing is just going to be a lot of clinging pans and pots and saying, yeah, we've got something. There's got to be real action towards some of these things. One of the other things that we've done, and we've done a really good job of, when we interview folks in any of our jobs, regardless of what it is, there has to be a question around DEI. One or more of your questions in the interview has to focus on the importance of DEI and what it means to that person. Because as much as we want the representation, one of the things that's just important is to have people inside that have a diversity, inclusion, and equity mindset. Having that mindset, making sure they understand what it is, why it's important to the agency, why it's important to them, why it's important to the folks that we serve, is just as important as having representation. So you got to make sure that that is a part of the things that you're doing when you're bringing folks into your organization. Also, your images, your branding, everything you have out on your web page has to be inclusive. Now, if you look at our web page, one of the things that I've had the good fortune to do is work with our communication department. Every time we change the images on our web page, we make sure there are a multiplicity of images. There's not just, and when I first started there, it was just basically old white males and then critters. Now we still have critters, but we also have some white males. We have some African-American families, we have Hispanic families, Asian families, we have folks that have disabilities and so on and so forth. We want to make sure that we're inclusive of everybody. When someone looks out there, they need to see themselves on your websites and some of your material. We need to check your language, make sure your language is inclusive, that you're not also using a lot of slangs and acronyms that folks don't understand. Those are the ways that you start moving the needle when it comes to hiring and when it comes to engaging folks in what you do and having an appreciation for all the things that you have to offer. And making sure that there's mentoring there and making sure you're doing those other things when it comes to branding to show that your agency is inclusive. Now, here's some questions, and I'm just going to go through these real quick, and then we're going to get to your questions. But these are some questions you need to ask yourself inside of your agency, inside of your organization, inside your department. First of all, why is inclusion, why is diversity, inclusion, and equity important to our mission? If you can't do that, if you can't identify that, first off, you're going to have some struggles. You got to identify why it's important to your mission. Then you got to be able to talk about, what are we doing? Are we really inclusive today? Now, most of us know the answer to that, but it's going to tie back to some of the things that you're measuring. Who's in your organization, who you're engaging, who's in leadership, who's being developed, so on and so forth. What are we doing today? What progress have we made? Not only what are some of the things that we've done that give you best results, but what should we stop doing? Are there some practices that we're doing right now that we probably shouldn't do because it's not adding value? It's not taking us in the direction that we need to go. The other thing is, who are we reaching out to? What organizations are we a part of that are supporting some of the things that we're doing internally and externally? And if I'm struggling with something, if I'm struggling to get something done, I have a strategic plan. Pausing for effect, because everybody should have a strategic plan. I have a strategic plan, but not everything we need to execute our strategic plan is in-house. Who do we need to call to get help? What are some of those things we can do to start moving the needle in a different direction? Sometimes it requires you reaching outside of your organization and bringing folks in, or at least getting somebody to give you an overview of what you're already doing and saying, yeah, that'll work, or yeah, you probably shouldn't do that anymore. One of the things we've done at Texas Parks and Wildlife, we developed something called an Urban Advisory Committee. And on that committee, we have folks from each of our metropolitan urban areas across the state of Texas that we put information in front of. Any type of campaign or program that we're developing, they give us feedback on how it's going to affect their community. we listen, we talk through it, we make the adjustments, because nobody can do this in a vacuum. I've been doing this a long time, and there's still things that I'm learning. So you got to make sure you're engaging the folks that you're serving, at the same time getting some feedback from the folks that are in terms of your agency. Now, the other one, this last thing, and I'm going to go to questions. It says, what does success look like? What are those things that you're measuring? Or what are some of those areas that you need to start really putting some numbers around, some matrix around? One of the things that I developed, and it actually came from my previous work in private industry, is what we call a grid model, where you're looking at where you're starting. What are some of those instrumental things you need to do around getting leadership on board? What are some of those things you have to do around communicating internally before you start communicating externally? What are the pillars that you need to focus on? Our 3 pillars, and everybody in our organization knows this, our 3 pillars are recruitment, retention, and the third one is a combo pillar, is education and engagement. It used to be education and outreach, but we changed the name outreach because outreach is too one way. Engagement says there's some reciprocity in what we're trying to do. So what are those things you're measuring within those different pillars, those different areas? And this is something that's very important, because I got this. We actually have a set of FAQs, frequently asked questions around diversity and inclusion. And one of the questions was, when do we know that we made it there? Well, you don't. This is a journey, not a destination. Keep that in mind. When you're talking about creating inclusion, it's a journey, not a destination. Always focus on the journey. And lastly, and I'm going to turn it over to whoever's doing the question. This is something that a good friend of mine shared with me, is as you're acting on these different things to try to move the needle, to try to get your organization focus on how to create a more inclusive organization, always act from your wisdom and not from your wounds. Get that emotional out of it. Think strategically. Think how it's going to add value. Talk value proposition to your leadership, because that's what they get measured on by the boards and different organizations that run your organization. How is what you're doing adding value to your organization? And with that, that was a lot in a short period of time, but I will turn it over for any questions.
All right, David. Oh, that was awesome. Like, so much. Like, you said a lot of things that resonated within me, myself. We, like, some of those people you featured and talked about, I would have never have known. So much broad history and just faces. Like, I have a friend, he actually sent a question. His name is Keith Ruffner, and I want to read his question because it is very important. He said, I am curious about ways I can better deliver messages of DEI to young children. I work at the Dallas Zoo. He works with me. I would like to encourage children of all genders and ethnicities to pursue careers in the field that are underrepresented by DEI. Is there a consistent message I can deliver that will have a significant impact on the children and the adults who may be modeling behavior of exclusivity and bias? Now, now he had more inside of that question. I had a shortened version of the question. But speaking of Ray Wingret, it goes in with this question. We have, at the Dallas Zoo, we have inside of our tunnel, we have something called If and Then, and it focuses on females, women in STEM, right? And they have so many different women in STEM up on that wall. And my coworker was saying how he walked past one day and he heard somebody say, look at all those women taking our jobs. So he would like to know, what are some of the rhetoric that he can use when talking to grownups or kids to get over some of those biases?
Well, one of the things, and I'm glad that question was put out there. One of the things that I think a lot of folks struggle with is yours and mine. And we all do, it's yours and mine. Even in our community, when different things pop up, we say, that's not my problem, that's their problem.
Yeah, you're right.
And we don't understand that it all belongs to us. any part of it that needs to be nurtured, sustained, managed, and all that is a part of who we are as well. Because if it goes away, if it dissipates, if it no longer exists, it affects all of us because it's a part of our ecosystem. And we talked about earlier, if anything in that ecosystem, it goes away, it creates chaos in that ecosystem. So we've got to talk about the importance of all of the things that we're doing when it comes to nature, when it comes to the outdoors. All of that belongs to us. And we're all to be good stewards of it. Now, addressing the gentleman that says, look at these whatever that are taking our jobs. Well, I won't say what I was thinking about saying because, you know, my mom might be listening. But folks have got to understand that this is not a zero-sum game proposition when it comes to managing or sustaining the outdoors. This is about all of us. When one person wins, everybody wins. The person that you're talking about that made that comment, they spoke out of ignorance. And sometimes you need to help educate folks, because they've got to recognize that, hey, look, if we don't all hang together, as Benjamin Franklin says it, we will all surely hang separately. Just as much as he is needed in what he's doing, other folks are needed to do the same thing. Some of the things that he is going to miss, that I would miss, somebody else will see clearly. That's why diversity and inclusion is so important, because together as a combination of folks, we can do things better. We can become more innovative. We can face more challenges. And that's just common sense. There's a book that was written a few years ago by a gentleman out of University of Michigan, Dr. Scott E. Page, called the diversity bonus. And he even has a formula that you can look at. Look that book up, diversity bonus. He has a formula that you can use that shows that anytime you add diversity to any program, any function, any challenge, and all that kind of stuff, you always get a better result.
Yeah, it thrives. It's just like an ecosystem. It thrives.
Exactly. There's a Native American biologist that worked for U.S. Fish and Wildlife. What is her name now? But anyway, when she was first hired, she asked to be placed on a team that was doing research on the high plains, where we had bison, because some of her heritage was there. And they reluctantly allowed her to participate on that research team. And what she observed, only female in the group, only Native American in the group, was this group of men going out, finding where the bison were. And you all know that there is a group of bison that are native to the U.S. Not all of them are native to the U.S., but there's a group that's native to the U.S. Matter of fact, we have some at Paladura, but we'll talk about that at a different time. Yeah. But she's going out in the field with these folks, and they're capturing these bison, taking them through trauma, capturing them, and then taking DNA samples, sticking them with needles, taking DNA samples, and then taking that information back to the lab to study to see if they're part of that native tribe. And she observed them do that a couple of times and saw the trauma that it was causing to the animals. And she said, "May I ask a question?" And they said, "Yeah, sure." She said, "Won't you get the same information if you just examine the scat?"
I get you.
They never thought about that.
Yeah, it's usually like a person, all you need is a new perspective. She was a new perspective right there.
Right.
It was the same group of guys, and then she came in and something as simple as that.
Yeah.
Helped to avoid all that trauma. I do have another question for you too.
Sure.
All right, here we go. Anonymous person asks, have you personally faced obstacles or challenges as a person of color in a typical like Anglo-Saxon conservation world? How did you overcome these obstacles?
First of all,
yeah, that's a hard.
I understand why you asked the question, but absolutely. Yeah. Be real honest about it. When I first started doing this work, after the first year, I almost quit. Because I saw some things happening and some folks that would look me in the eye and tell me, yeah, Mr. Bugs, all this sounds good, but as long as I'm doing this work, we're not going to do all of that.
Goodness.
So yes,
Yeah.
but here's the thing that I've recognized. There are going to be some folks that are never going to change. But there's a huge group of folks that are ready. But what they need to see is somebody that's willing to give them some guidance on how to do it.
That's usually the case. They just need somebody who they can focus on, who can guide them there.
Yeah. So yes, I face it. I still run into some of that at different places. I was at a conference not too long ago out in California. And I had a guy that got up and started banging on the table and talking about what needs to happen and all this other stuff you're talking about is for naught. You just need to do this, and we don't need to get all these other folks involved in it. And the thing that blew my mind is this person works for one of our federal organizations, and they're in leadership. They even said, I don't know if I want all of these people trampling all over my land.
That's a last thing, like that's a problem that you see over and over in many fields, many different fields. And as we continue to move that needle forward, yeah, it is a accumulated effort. All these people you said, who you named, who you were in network with, they help to build for the next generation. We work with kids at the zoo. And this is a question for me or a statement for me. And the first thing they teach us is when kids look at an animal, they want to look the animal in the eye. They want the animal to see them in the eyes. And that goes for people too. Like when kids are doing stuff or when people are doing stuff, they just want somebody to see them. I want to see somebody who sees me and helps me to bring the next people over. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like to know I exist, because a lot of people think when you talk about diversity that you're talking about the vision, and all I care about is this type of person or that type of person there. We just want to be seen, being seen and being heard.
Yeah. And one of the things that I think is very important is also let it be known that we care as well. That this is something that's important to all of us, not just to a certain group of folks. We all care. We all came from that outdoor background. We had to, and it's still a part of who we are. Now, there are some concerns and fear for some folks. There was a study that was done. It's called the Nature of Americans. And you can go out, it's actually published out on the web now. We actually pay for a part of that study to be done in Texas, but it's a nationwide study. And they talked about the lack of engagement by people of color in the outdoors. Well, the first question they asked was, do you have an appreciation? Everybody had the same level, basically, of appreciation for the outdoors, but not everybody was engaged at the same level. But now the reason why blew their mind, because the assumption was biophobia. And there is a little bit of that in different communities. But the major reason was safety. Their concern was not what was in the outdoors, but who.
I'm glad you touched on that topic right there. Right there, that point right there that you just talked on. Like you said earlier when you were talking, that certain times Black folk could say that's not for us. That's not for me.
Right.
Like me and my wife, we do bird watching and herpetology. And oftentimes we're out there, somebody be like, what you doing over there, Black person? And they give us that, oh, look. I have a question from Brian Bird that kind of lines up. He said, we have a hard time attracting African-Americans applicants to some of our job listings. Do you have any suggestion for how to reach that applicant pool? Like some people may not apply because they feel like it's not for them. Do you have any suggestions on how they can widen that up and bring those applicants in?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, there's a saying that says, if I don't see me, it won't be me. So who are you sending to job fairs? Who are you sending to go out and recruit? What do the images look like on the information that you're putting out there? Because if I don't see me, it won't be me. And you can do targeted campaigns for different groups. But another thing, and this is something that I tell my folks all the time, because I hear the same mantra, I heard that since I've gotten there. We're starting to do better now. We're actually, I won't say we're stealing folks from other organizations, but folks are starting to see that this is a good place to come.
Yeah.
They look at our website and they see that we have a DEI web page, which kind of blows folks' minds for a state agency. But the other side of it is, if you can't find full-grown apples, oranges, peaches, and plums, then you need to grow some trees. You gotta go out and start developing programs within universities, some of the HBCUs, MSIs, so on and so forth, or even encouraging folks while they're in high school
Start
to
early.
major in these different areas. Give them some opportunities to go out and do some of the works. One of the things that we participate in is a Hudson Scholar program. We started doing this about 3 years ago through our freshwater fisheries group, and now our ocean group is doing the same. Our Gulf group is doing the same. But the Hudson Scholars provides dollars for high school students, people of color, to come and work for us during the summer, paid.
Oh yeah, paid is always good.
And that's something else that has to be a part of that line, is paid internships. Because we cannot afford, we don't have the support to go and do a lot of stuff free. Because usually during the summer, if we're not in school, we're working somewhere to provide funds so we can go back to school.
I hear that a lot. I actually hear that a lot.
So we've got to provide paid internships. Now, the other side of that is, sometimes if it's a government organization, you can't use government funds to do it. There are a lot of private donors out there that would do that. For instance, we have something called Al Henry Scholarship Program that is exclusively for people of color. But the sponsorship comes from the Houston Rodeo, San Antonio Rodeo, CCA, so on and so forth, because those organizations also want to see more inclusion in conservation. So they provide dollars to us on an annual basis. Then we can go out and name who we want to participate in this opportunity. We don't have to just put it out there and hope we get a person of color or hope we get a female. We can go directly to them and say, hey, look, your professor said X, Y, and Z about you. Would you be willing to participate in this? And it's paid.
Man, that's awesome. Well, I could sit here and talk to you all day about this. We have a lot of questions too, but we had a lot of good questions, but just being mindful of everybody's time. We're gonna have to call this our time. But I do have some house cleaning notes right here too. Also, David, if you feel like answering some of those questions inside of the question, you have access to that even after we go up, probably. We thank you. First of all, we want to thank you, David, for doing this. You gave us a lot of information, and we thank you for continuing to being one of the Black men out there keeping that needle moving forward. We need more of that, and we thank you for what you do. This will be recorded, and it'll be sent to everyone. Everything that David said will be sent to everyone who signed up, and everybody who signed up will get sent it. Next Wednesday on the 8th at 3 p.m., we're going to have Crystal Tony, and we're going to be talking about barriers to bridges, wildlife biodiversity. That's another good topic. Like David mentioned it multiple times about biodiversity, and we're going to talk about that next week. And finally, I'd like to thank everybody who's here. I thank you for the questions, even though we couldn't get them all. I'm thrilled that we got to get together for this time in Black History Month. And David, continue pushing on. I'm so happy that I had a chance to talk to you.
Hey, same here. I enjoyed it. Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate the opportunity. Anything you all need me to do, just as the song says, you just call out my name, and wherever I am, I'll come running.
I will be in touch.
All right. Thank you all. Thanks again.
Thanks again.